Hello again. I wanted to respond to one of the recent videos that Doron had put up on the Piece of Hebrew channel called Jewish Humor to Ease the Pain. Once again, because I think there really are some things that need to be called out here, and I think that viewers of that video should keep in mind about what I have to say about this. The first thing to realize is that, putting some exceptions aside, which I'll get to for a second, the humor that Doron is talking about, and which he shows in the video, is not Jewish humor, it's Israeli humor. It's modern Israeli humor, and unfortunately, it is indicative of a very deep kind of pathology in Israeli society now, and it's not good humor at all. The very first thing that Doron shows you are two sections of some skits from a show on Israeli television, which were produced shortly after October 7th. Now, Doron says that that this is a good sketch show. He doesn't comment a lot about it, but the very fact that he chooses to include them and gives it a positive endorsement, I think, speaks to the degree to which Doron is really, like many Israelis, not all, but many, living in this bubble, which separates them from the rest of the world and which reflects really how out of touch they are with what's going on around them. Just take, for instance, these two skits that he showed. One of them purports to mock hyper woke American college students who are choosing to side with Hamas simply because I guess that's sort of a uncritical siding with sort of a victim here. But notice that in the first skit, these two people are mocking the Palestinian cry for freedom from their oppression in Israeli apartheid. Those students are mocking it. I mean, this is really a contemptuous show of an arrogance showed by many Israelis towards the people that they're murdering and that they have basically been oppressing for the entire history of the Israeli state, and whose oppression really is beginning so bad now that most Israelis really just refuse to talk about it. Much like Doron himself, actually. He refused even to admit that this is technically an occupation, and it is by all meaningful, credible legal authorities in the international world, as well as many Israelis themselves. The fact that, say, some of these students, that is the students in the skit, right? The fact that they're basically making fun of this kind of meaningful cry of Palestinians, a phrase that was actually coined by notable Palestinian poet, meant to be basically a reclaiming or inversion of the Likud party statement about from the river to the sea, which is effectively a very cruel, nasty statement of ethnic supremacy, because the Likud party's official platform really is one of ethnic cleansing. It really is one of committed to the destruction of the Palestinian state by smothering it in its crib. It states that from the land to the sea, all of supposedly historical Israel belongs only to the Jewish people in the Israeli state, in direct contravention to historical realities. I mean, how disgusting could one be by making fun of this chant? It's really equivalent to, say, white supremacists or white slave owners making fun of the Christian spiritual chants of African Americans simply because those white slave owners had contempt. So that's quite disgusting type of humor. And then the second one, talking about essentially how apparently seemingly Western sources randomly or capriciously inflate death statistics from the bombing in Gaza. I mean, just take a second to think about what's going on here. Israel is committing a genocide by the evaluation of actually experts in what genocide is. And then this skit its point is sort of saying, well, maybe the outsiders, right? It's funny because they like to just sort of inflate the number of people we're killing with our bombs in the hundreds. I mean, how disgusting is that? And Doron thinks that this is some sort of good kind of humor. He thinks the problem is that universities are too, quote, woke. He doesn't get into any of the criticisms that, of course, are coming out of universities, but the universities really are just the tip of the iceberg. The rest of the world feels this way, if you haven't noticed from all of the massive demonstrations, if you haven't actually read all of the books by scholars, people like Norman Finkelstein or Ilan Pape or Noam Chomsky. So many scholars really. I don't need to list them here. I mean, it's a sad note to realize that Doron thinks that the problem here is sort of either woke campus culture, and no, it's not the young students. I mean, whatever. Some students can be woke for other reasons, but they actually see the truth, like most of the world, including the Arab world, which I'm sure Doron would never consider for a second, because he thinks they're simply incapable of actually seeing things for the truth, and that they're just out because their bias or somehow would be so great against Jews that it would prevent them from thinking rationally. But once again, that is a misperception on Doron's part, because he conflates Zionism with Judaism. He thinks that Israel, the nation state, and what it does is the center of Judaism. And he buys all these sort of, all this propaganda and lies essentially coming from the Israeli government about how everything that is critical of their policies essentially equates anti-Semitism. I don't think Doron even understands what a Jew is. You can ask him, and I don't think he'll be able to give you an answer. And if he can't give you an answer of what a Jew is, how could he really know what counts as anti-Semitism? So this is the first part. The point I'd wish to talk about is how Doron brings up the legacy of the Holocaust, and how correctly people who managed to sort of survive great trauma, either individually or I guess as a group, right? Surviving group trauma. One way they have coping with it is essentially having a kind of indomitable spirit of levity, not delusional levity, but sort of being able to find the silver lining in clouds. This is a perfectly reasonable point to make. And as far as Jews as a whole are concerned, the fact that, say, people in the concentration camps, Jews as well as other political prisoners, gays, Romani and such, the people who had the strongest will to survive, they often did have a kind of grim sense of humor, the gallows humor. That is certainly true. And I don't think there's any problem in saying that some memory of that, or the kind of the lessons of that coping technique being cultivated, perpetuated in future generations. Nothing wrong with that. But the problem here, once again, is Doron basically is trying to graft that onto the experience of Israelis on October 7th. It's not an appropriate grafting at all. For one thing, Israel has essentially wiped out any meaningful kind of, I would say really, I mean, of course, having sympathy for the specific victims, families of civilians, and yes, even soldiers and other combatants who were killed on October 7th. I mean, their sympathy and sympathy with them, understanding that they, should be allowed to have coping mechanisms of a variety of means. I mean, that's all perfectly fine. But really, the rest of Israeli society, to think that they're somehow victims equivalent to the Holocaust, and then they go on to commit ethnic cleansing and genocide, and they still think, right, 2 months out, they are really being the victims here, and what they have to do is find whatever source of humor to get through it. That is quite pathetic. It's pathetic for the people who live in a bubble like Doron, who don't understand what their government is doing with their permission, or even with the enthusiastic support of the citizens, if one is to judge from the most recent poll. And it really speaks again to this kind of false victimization complex that Israelis are basically, most, not all, right? Some manage to see through this, that they are brought up in as a kind of reflexive defense against any kind of criticism of themselves as Israelis, what their state does. And the way you can tell that it's basically an unjustified or false victimization complex is you go through the reasoning. Does it account with the facts? And it doesn't, right? Doron has nothing to say about the so-called anti-Semitism coming out of the campuses and the world, right? I mean, there is a minority, yes, of sort of what people would sort of unquestionably call anti-Semitism, but in fact, many of these claims are exaggerated or false, misheard, misreported. The rest of it is legitimate criticism. Many of it is coming from Jews themselves. If you actually look at the reasons, the logic, and the facts of history, it is undeniable. And so in general, not in entirety, but in general, the concern with the growing anti-Semitism on campuses, right, is false. It is a false flag promoted mostly, but not entirely, by, say, the Israeli government and its allies, say AIPAC and other essentially ruling elites in the West, to cover their complicity or even support of what is going on right now in Gaza, or how they have been supporting the Israeli occupation of Gaza and the West Bank for a long time, and the veil of legitimacy has been pulled completely off of what they are trying to do. And so they're desperately trying to distract people. You can find much more about this stated in many places, including this very recent article written by Chris Hedges about the sad state of Israeli society, how far it has fallen because it is failing to really address the crisis of its settler colonial legacy, its dominant Zionist ideology. So I've gotten a little off the track about the point about the Holocaust. So just to repeat again, once that this is largely grafting an inappropriate cultural reference. I mean, Doron says that he's, I guess his grandfather is a Holocaust survivor. I wish that that person, that Doron, could actually speak to his grandfather about the lessons that the people in those concentration camps actually learned. Because generally speaking, those people in history, right, those people were not in favor of the Zionist project. I mean, whatever else they may have thought about sort of establishing part of Palestine for letting Jews to settle, right? Generally speaking, they were against the militant project, which the Zionists like Jabotinsky wanted to execute and that were executed, right, by David Ben-Gurion, because they understood what it meant to be in a place of oppression. They understood what was more important in life, right? They found the things to value that allowed them to get through, of course, the horrors of the camp themselves. And then, of course, many intellectuals like Martin Buber, Hannah Arendt, right, Jews argued quite vociferously for a more cooperative solution to establishing a kind of, call it a peaceful Zionist state with the Arabs, but they were largely not listened to. So once again, I think it's in a comment of how much of a bubble that Doron is living in, and the rest of Israelis are, that they keep drawing on the Holocaust in inappropriate ways. If anything, really, what's going on mirrors much more Nazi Germany, insofar as you have a population that is vastly out of touch with the rest of the world, arrogantly, militantly, chauvinistic, nationalistic, right? Chauvinistically nationalist, believes that it is in a life and death struggle with really a people that is under their power, right? In this case, the Palestinians, and is sort of so convinced of its own victimization that when people try to point out the wrong things with their society and how they're doing things wrong, they simply dismiss it as sort of a hatred that isn't even really targeted at the right people, right? Once again, Israelis think that they speak for all Jews. They don't. That is wrong. That is a mistake of, I mean, I think you realize to admit it, right? That is a mistake of the Zionist project to set up the Jewish state as somehow the pinnacle, the representation for all Jews around the world. That is precisely the danger of state religion, right? Or these kinds of ethno-nationalist states. We see this all the time with regard to Christianity or Islam or Buddhism. This is exactly the kind of thing that those other, either the anti-Zionists or the alternative Zionists like Martin Buber and Hannah Arendt saw all along. And it's not that hard to understand once you know the pieces. But most Israelis are not, some are, but not all, are not taught these pieces. They're not taught the real history of their own country. And what we're seeing now with the massive delusion, the inability of many Israelis to cope with what is going on, with the defeat of their own military by Hamas in a stand-up fight, the fact that the world is turning against them even more, right? Even though really the bully of the world, right, the American elites, right, and the kind of imperial structure that represents is still sort of shielding them. The last thing that I'll talk about is the rest of the humor here. I mean, once again, you can make fun of, a certain soldier with a broken leg and such, but I don't think there's actually, it's not that Israelis should be finding the kind of gallows humor of sort of a victim of a concentration camp. That's the gallows humor is the one that the Palestinians are drawing on. If you look at the social media, if you look at the jokes and the way that they're dealing with the situation, right, of their obliteration with the express permission, or at least the tacit permission of much of Israeli society, right, that is the gallows humor, right? That's where you're going to find tenacity, or in the West Bank, where Palestinians are being subject to basically murderous rampages and terrorism by illegal settlers supported explicitly by the government, the same government that is being rightly blamed for security lapses. So no, I don't think there's a lot of humor that many Israelis should find, because they have been in a position of arrogance and delusion and moral bankruptcy for a long time. So they're going to have to basically do some deep soul searching. They're going to have to get with reality. Otherwise, I mean, it's just a fact, right, that their society will crumble even further, much more further. Although if you read Hedges' article, you realize that, I mean, really, it's really sort of, without serious external intervention, it's really going past the point of no return, as basically the kind of more secular-minded, liberal, even anti-Zionist people are essentially leaving the country because it's becoming intolerable. They're being persecuted. The society is just becoming a very kind of a perversion of what Judaism in the past 1700 years has represented, being fundamentally against state religion, right, in this very broad sense, right, the ethno-nationalism, right, being against sort of the worship of land, the worship of militancy, the inability sort of to criticize oneself and to undergo fundamental self-examination, right? These are all the things that have made Judaism a worthy thing through the ages. And that has all been jettisoned largely by not just the current administration, really, but some of this really is deeply rooted in the founding principles of the Israeli state. And yes, we can talk about how, so to speak, of course, that's not completely the Zionist fault, right? Of course, cycles of violence and oppression dehumanize both the oppressor and the oppressed. And the Gentile oppressors, medieval Europe or early, I think, the worst part of it really is actually in the modern period, right? The oppression of the minority Jewish community, in particular in Eastern Europe, right? The sins of that carry forward in the scarred attitudes of the Zionists who were wounded. They saw the wounds of the Jewish religion, the Jewish community are in Europe, not necessarily in the Middle East or elsewhere, but yes, in Europe. And unfortunately, they didn't learn the right lessons. And so there, right, the sins of the persecution of the Jews is carried forward into the next generation of the Zionists, and it gets imprinted into the Israeli state. And now those sins are being carried forth as the Israelis now, not the Jews, as the Israelis are the oppressors of the Palestinian people. And of course, even that now, right, the oppressor and the oppressed being dehumanized. Palestinians, some of them, of course, have committed heinous crimes and atrocities. But as always, you have to look at the history, you have to understand the facts, you have to understand who is the driving power which motivates mostly the cycle of violence, and it has always been really the Israeli state, with a hefty, sickening dose of enablement from the United States or Europe. And as the United States' empire is failing, so is the Israeli apartheid state. So I hope, once again, most of this in this video of Doron's is Israeli humor. If there's anything funny, it's just how much of a bubble that Doron seems to be living in, that he thinks that these things that he's offering us are funny to the rest of the world when they're usually not. And I would encourage him to try to get an external perspective on what is going on in his country, because otherwise it's just going to look more and more ridiculous. And I guess that is kind of funny, but it's not even gallows humor. It's just pitiful humor.